Hey crew, it's Pitt, and I am back with some more ancient lore. We will be diving in today to the beginnings of Marcus Aurelius Antonius's meditations. These are his personal musings written down. We're going to be reading through the introduction today. This is by, what's the guy's name? Gregory Hayes.
It's a long introduction. There will be a lot of reading. I don't know that there's a whole lot for me to extrapolate on in the introduction. But you know me, I like to lay the foundations. I'm wanting to pick up a third hour of content. My voice is doing a lot better these days, and the more I can do, the more strengthening it get. This is probably going to be a bit long because the introduction is a long piece. I'm not going to try and interrupt it, but there may be some cuts. My voice may not hold out. I may have to stop. I may have to pick up again later. I will be reading aloud. We will be discussing these things. That's what I do over here. If you are unfamiliar with me, any of my unconventional beliefs, or if at any point in time you get lost in the weeds, don't understand the terminology, have no clue what I am talking about, there will be several playlists linked in the corner up here and in the box down below, along with the original source material, so that you can go and understand. I tend to put towards the beginning of the playlist the definitions and the things that I am talking about. I try to be clear as I go along, but it doesn't always happen that way. That's why the playlists are handy. I will refer several times back to any playlist that is pertinent to the current topic. With that being said, I do have a playlist, Ancient Lore, where we deal with Plato. We read aloud from several of his different writings. We dealt with Critias and Timaeus. We read the entirety of the Republic. There are a couple other ones in there, I believe. We're not done with Plato yet, but we're going to check out Marcus Aurelius today. So let's go ahead and dive into the text and see where it leads. This is the introduction to Marcus Aurelius's Meditations. States, will never be happy until
Rulers become philosophers or philosophers become rulers. Plato, The Republic. If my voice going in and out bothers you, I'm sorry, there's nothing I can do about it. This is, in part, vocal therapy. I'm here to increase knowledge. I am here to help dispense a little bit of wisdom and even enlightenment. But it is a work in progress for my voice. So if that bothers you, I'm sorry, but there's nothing I can do about it. It will go high, it will go low, especially since this is the third hour of the day.
Marcus Aurelius is said to have been fond of quoting Plato's dictum, and those who have written about him have rarely been able to resist applying it to Marcus himself. And indeed, if we seek Plato's philosopher king in the flesh, we could hardly do better than Marcus, the ruler of the Roman Empire for almost 2 decades, and author of the immortal Meditations. Yet the title is one that Marcus himself would surely have rejected. He never thought of himself as a philosopher. He would have claimed to be, at best, a diligent student and a very imperfect practitioner of a philosophy developed by others. As for the imperial throne, that came almost by accident. When Marcus Annius Verus was born in AD 121, bystanders may have predicted a distinguished career in the Senate or the imperial administration. They could hardly have guessed that he was destined for the imperial purple, or, seen in their mind's eye, the lonely bronze horseman whose upraised hand greets us from the Capitoline Hill in Rome across 2,000 years. Marcus sprang from a distinguished enough family. The year of his birth coincided with his grandfather's second tenure of the consulship, in theory Rome's highest office, though now of a largely ceremonial importance. And it was to be his grandfather who brought him up, for his father died when he was very young. Marcus makes reference in the Meditations to his father's character as he remembered it, or heard of it from others, but his knowledge must have been more from stories than from actual memories. Of the remainder of his childhood and his early adolescence, we know little more than can be gleaned from the Meditations. The biography of him in the so-called Historia Augusta, a curious and unreliable work of the late 4th century, probably based on a lost series of lives by the 3rd century biographer Marius Maximus, tells us that he was a serious child, but also that he loved boxing, wrestling, running, and falconry, that he was a good ball player, and then he loved to hunt. None of these are surprising occupations in an upper-class youth. Book 1 of the Meditations offers glimpses into Marcus's schooling, and we can fill out the picture by what is known of upper-class education generally at this period. His first instructors, like the unnamed teacher mentioned in Meditations 1.5, were probably slaves, from whom he would have mastered the rudiments of reading and writing. At a later stage, he would have been handed over to private tutors to be introduced to literature, especially, no doubt, Virgil's great epic, the Aeneid. But literature served only as a preparation for the real goal. This was rhetoric, the key to an active political career under the Empire, as it had been under the Republic. Under the supervision of a trained rhetor, Marcus would have begun with short exercises before progressing to full-scale practice declamations in which he would have been asked to defend one side or another in imaginary law cases, or to advise a prominent historical figure at a turning point in his career. Should Caesar cross the Rubicon? Should Alexander turn back at the Indus? Why or why not? Such training was conducted in Greek as well as Latin, and since at least the beginning of the 1st century BC, the Roman upper classes had been essentially bilingual, and Marcus's spoken and written Greek would have been as fluent as the free French of a 19th century Russian aristocrat or the Chinese of a high-end Japanese courtier. Marcus would have read Homer's Iliad and Odyssey and the tragedies of Euripides side by side with the Aeneid, and studied the speeches of the great Athenian orator Demosthenes as intensively as those of the Roman statesman Cicero. It was Greek writers and artists who constituted the intellectual elite at the capital. When, in later life, the emperor conversed with his court physician, Galen, he would have done so in the latter's native tongue. Above all, Greek remained overwhelmingly the language of philosophy. In the late Republic and early Empire, writers like Lucretius, Cicero, and Seneca had worked to create a philosophical literature in Latin, with notable success. But the great thinkers, Plato, Aristotle, Theophrastus, Zeno, Chrysippus, Epicurus, etc., had all been Greeks. Serious philosophical investigation required a familiarity with the language they wrote in and the terminology they developed. That Marcus composed his own meditations in Greek is natural enough. In 137, when Marcus was 16, a crucial event took place. The reigning emperor, Hadrian, was childless. An illness had brought him near to death a year previously, and it was clear that he would not live forever. Hadrian owed his throne to his adoption by his predecessor and distant relative, Trajan. Following Trajan's example, Hadrian had designated the distinguished aristocrat Lucius Caius Commodus to succeed him. In 137, however, Caius died unexpectedly, and Hadrian was forced to cast about for a new successor. His choice fell on the childless senator Antonius, whom he selected with the proviso that Antonius should in turn adopt Marcus, his nephew by marriage, along with Caius' son Lucius Verus, then aged 7. Marcus took on the family name of his adopted father, becoming Marcus Aurelius Antonius. Hadrian's death the following year left Marcus first in line for the throne. His education and that of the younger Verus were now matters of still greater concern, and it is clear that no expense was spared. For training in Greek rhetoric, he was entrusted to Herodes Atticus, a fabulously wealthy Athenian rhetorician, whose tempestuous relations with his family, fellow citizens, and the imperial court itself would have furnished ample material for a soap opera. His instructor in Latin oratory was Marcus Cornelius Fronto, a prominent rhetorician from Cirta in North Africa. By an accident of fate, many of Fronto's letters to Marcus have survived, and they illustrate the close relationship between student and teacher. They also suggest Fronto's regret at seeing Marcus move away from rhetoric to delve ever more deeply into philosophy. The first book of the Meditations pays tribute to a number of philosophers from whom Marcus learned, both formally and informally, and he is likely to have studied with or listened to many others. Marcus would have learned much outside of the classrooms as well, for training in legal and political matters and informal apprenticeship bound aristocratic youths to older public figures, men like Junius Rusticus, whose influence Marcus chronicles in 1.7. But the single greatest influence was surely Marcus's adopted father, Antonius Pius. Marcus would have watched as Antonius received embassies, tried legal cases, and dictated letters to his deputies. Meanwhile, Marcus's own position as heir apparent was signaled in various ways. In 140, he served as consul at the age of 19, and would serve again in 145. In the same year, he married Antonius's daughter, Faustina, to whom he pays tribute in Meditations 1.17. Edward Gibbon's History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire describes the reign of Antonius as furnishing very few materials for history, which is indeed little more than the register of the crimes, follies, and misfortunes of mankind. It furnishes equally little material for Marcus's biography. In the decade and a half between 145 and 161, we learn little of Marcus's occupations, and our only glimpses of his inner development come from his correspondence with Fronto. But the two poles that would have governed the remainder of his life, the court and philosophy, seem to by this point to be fully established. There is no evidence that Marcus experienced anything like the conversion to philosophy that some ancient figures experienced or affected, but it is clear that by the middle to the late 140s, philosophy was becoming increasingly central to his life. On August 31st, 161, Antonius died, leaving Marcus as his sole successor. Marcus immediately acted to carry out what appears to have been Hadrian's original intention, perhaps ignored by Antonius, by pushing through the appointment of his adopted brother, Lucius Verus, as co-regent. Verus's character has suffered by comparison with Marcus's. Ancient sources, in particular the gossipy Historia Augusta, tend to paint him as a self-indulgent degenerate, almost another Nero. This may be unfair. It is certainly not the picture of him we get from Marcus's own reminiscences in the Meditations. It does seem clear, however, that Marcus functioned as the senior emperor in fact, if not in name. It would be surprising if he had not. He was almost a decade older and had been trained for the position by Antonius himself. What kind of ruler did this philosopher king prove to be? Not, perhaps, as different from his predecessors as one might have expected. Though an emperor was all-powerful in theory, his ability to control policy was in reality much more limited. Much of his time was spent fielding problems that had moved up the administrative ladder, receiving embassies from the large cities of the empire, trying appeals of criminal cases, answering queries from provincial governors, and dealing with petitions from individuals. Even with a functional system of imperial couriers, news could take weeks to travel from the periphery of the empire to the center. Imperial edicts took time to move down the chain of command. While the emperor's decision had the force of law, enforcement was almost entirely in the hands of provincial governors, whose diligence might be affected by incompetence, corruption, or an understandable desire not to antagonize local elites. We get occasional glimpses of Marcus's day-to-day duties from the evidence of imperial decisions preserved in letters, inscriptions, and the legal codes. Surviving legislation shows a certain interest in the freeing of slaves and in the regulations relating to the guardianship of orphans. Attempts have been made to tie the first to Marcus's philosophical convictions and the second to his own memories of life without a father. But it remains unclear how much of the policy is due to Marcus himself and how far it differs from that of Marcus's predecessor Antonius. Perhaps more interesting are the traces of Marcus's personality to be discerned in the phrasing of imperial documents, where we find a scrupulous attention to detail and a self-consciousness about linguistic usage that seems to differentiate Marcus from his predecessors. Neither trait surprises in the author of the Meditations or a student of Fronto, whose extant letters place great stress on the quest for the mot juste. One of Marcus's priorities was to preserve good relations with the Senate. The goal was to disguise the absoluteness with which the emperor ruled, to preserve a facade, and sometimes, no doubt, even to achieve the reality of consensus and cooperation. 100 years before aristocrats might have dreamed of a restored republic, as some certainly did, but by the 2nd century it was clear that there was no alternative to the Principate. The Senate expected deference in public and hoped for influence behind the scenes. Good emperors were willing to play along. In cultivating the upper classes, Marcus was following in the footsteps of Antonius and Trajan, rather than of Hadrian, whose relations with the Senate had been prickly. And it is this, as much as anything else, that is responsible for his reputation as a benevolent statesman. An emperor might do as he liked while he lived, but it was the senatorial historians, men like Cornelius Tacitus in the 120s or Cassius Dio in the generation after Marcus's death, who had the last word. Another area where Marcus's policy continued that of his predecessors related to a small and eccentric sect known as the Christians. In the course of the next century, they would become an increasing problem for the imperial administration, and they were prominent enough in Marcus's day to attract an extended denunciation from a certain Celsus, part of whose work against the Christians still survives. The sect met with contempt from those intellectuals who deigned to take notice of it. Marcus's tutor Fronto was evidently one, and with suspicion and hostility from ordinary citizens and administrators. The Christians' disfavor stemmed from their failure to acknowledge the gods worshipped by the community around them, their atheism. Their refusal to accept any god but their own endangered their neighbors as well as themselves, and their reluctance to acknowledge the divine status of the emperor threatened the social order and the well-being of the state. Christianity had been illegal since the early 2nd century, when a query from Pliny the Younger, then governor of Bithynia in Asia Minor, prompted the Emperor Trajan to establish a formal policy. While Christians were not to be sought out, those who confessed of the faith were to be executed. But empire-wide persecution did not become a reality until a much later date. The main threat to Christians in the 2nd century came from individual provincial governors, acting either on their own initiative or under pressure from local communities. In the late 170s, for example, civic unrest at Lyons resulted in a virtual pogrom of Greek-speaking Christians resident there. Marcus's mentor, Junius Rusticus, had tried and executed Christians, the apologist Justin Martyr among them, in his capacity as city prefect. Marcus himself was no doubt aware of Christianity, but there is no reason to think that it bulked large in his mind. The one direct reference to it in the Meditations, 11.3, is almost certainly a later interpolation, and the implicit references some scholars have discerned are surely illusory. Christianity does have a tendency to self-insert. Marcus, in any case, had more serious concerns than this troublesome cult. Soon after his ascension, relations between Rome and its only rival, the Parthian Empire in the east, took a dramatic turn for the worse. Since at least the time of Trajan, the two states had been locked in a cold war that would continue for the next 2 centuries, and that once a generation or so flared up into military conflict. The death of Antonius and the accession of 2 new and untried rulers may have tempted the Parthian ruler Vologases III to test the waters. In 162, his forces occupied Armenia and wiped out a Roman garrison that had gone to the rescue. Syria itself was threatened. Rome had no choice but to respond. It was Varus, the younger emperor, who was sent east, where he remained for the next 4 years. Neither he nor Marcus had any military experience to speak of. Antonius's peaceful reign had given little scope for it, and the day-to-day conduct of war was no doubt left to the professionals. After initial setbacks, the Romans rallied, and under such commanders as the dynamic young Avidius Cassius, forced the Parthians to sue for peace. Parthia would remain a threat, but one that could be dealt with by diplomatic means for the immediate future. Varus and his senior colleague had no time to bask in their triumph, however. Within a year, the empire was in the grip of a devastating plague, apparently brought back from the east by Lucius's troops. Its effects may not have been quite as apocalyptic as later writers suggest, but the death toll was certainly high, and it also delayed the emperor's response to a second threat. This was the increasing instability on the empire's other border, the northern frontier that separated Rome from the barbarian peoples of Germany, Eastern Europe, and Scandinavia. During this period, a number of those tribes were under pressure from people farther north and reacted by moving across the empire's borders, not for conquest, but in search of land to settle. Rome's reaction alternated between aggressive resistance and attempts at accommodation. Its failure to develop a workable policy would eventually result in the collapse of the Western Empire some 3 centuries later. In some places, a line could be drawn. Hadrian's Great Wall, stretching across Britain, was intended to secure the empire's most distant frontier. Under Antonius, it had been briefly superseded by a second line further to the north, but such fortifications were impracticable on the continent, and it was there that the threat was concentrated. Rome still remembered the catastrophe of AD 9, when the Roman general Varus and 3 legions had marched into the forests of Germany, never to return. In the 2nd century, the greatest source of anxiety was the area farther south, roughly corresponding to modern-day Romania and Hungary. Trajan's conquest of Dacia 2 generations before had cleared out a possible source of trouble, but the potential for friction remained. In Marcus's day, 3 people presented a special problem: the Quadi, the Macromani, and the Jazyges, also called Samaritans. The removal of 3 legions to Parthia had seriously weakened the Roman position on the northern frontier, and barbarians took advantage of the situation. In 168, Marcus and Varus marched north to deal with them. Much of the remainder of the reign would be spent on intermittent warfare, first in so-called Macromanic wars of the early 170s, and then in a second campaign later in the decade. And most of the burden was to be borne by Marcus alone, for Varus died suddenly, apparently of a stroke, in early 169. It was a very different kind of war than the traditional campaign Varus's armies had waged. The conventional military and diplomatic tactics that worked against the Parthians were of limited use here. Instead, the Romans had to negotiate with individual chieftains, whose authority was limited and whose reliability was always in doubt. When negotiation failed, the only alternative was a slow and bloody succession of small-scale engagements, rather than pitched battles. The progress of the campaign is recorded on the column erected in Rome to commemorate the close of the Macromanic Wars. In spite of its triumphal purpose, the engraved scenes that spiral around the monument paint a grim picture of brutal fighting, devastation, and execution. Spiders are proud of catching flies, Marcus notes mordantly. Men of catching hares, fish in a net, boars, bears, Samaritans. The gruesome vignette that opens Meditations 8.34, a severed hand or foot, or a decapitated head, may well reflect Marcus's own experience. By 175, the Romans seem to have gained the upper hand, but at this point disturbing news arrived. Avidius Cassius, who had distinguished himself as a general during the Parthian War, and who, as governor of Syria, now served as virtual regent of the Eastern Empire, had revolted and declared himself emperor. Some of the eastern provinces, notably Cappadocia, remained loyal to Marcus, but Cassius was recognized as emperor throughout much of the east, and in particular in Egypt, whose grain supply was crucial to the capital. Civil war seemed inevitable, and was prevented only by Cassius's assassinations at the hand of a subordinate. Marcus was nevertheless obliged to travel east to reassert his authority, taking with him Faustina, who died in the course of the journey. He visited the major cities of the east, Antioch and Alexandria, arriving finally at Athens, where he was initiated into the Eleusinian mysteries, a set of mystic rites connected with the worship of Demeter, the goddess of agriculture. Now in his 50s, Marcus was in declining health, and the revolt of Cassius had only underlined the need to make arrangements for the succession. Faustina had borne at least 13 children, many of whom had died young. By the mid-170s, Marcus had only one remaining son, Commodus, just entering his teens. There was no reason for Marcus to continue the policy of adoption followed by his predecessors, and there is no reason to think he even considered it. The years that follow see Commodus's rapid promotion to a position not far short of co-emperor. He was consul in 177 at the age of 15. In the same year, he was accorded all the major imperial privileges, except for the post of Pontifex Maximus, the head of the Roman state religion, held by the reigning emperor alone and for life. The gains of the Marco-Manic Wars had not proved permanent, and in 178 Marcus and Commodus marched north again. 2 years later, Marcus died at age 58, the first emperor to pass on the throne, and to his son since Vespasian, a century before. Sadly, Commodus's performance did not bear out whatever promise Marcus had discerned in him. He was to be remembered as a dissolute tyrant, a second Caligula or Nero, whose many defects were only emphasized by the contrast with his father. His assassination after a 12-year reign would usher in the first in a series of power struggles that would burden the empire for the next century. Philosophical background. The composition of Meditations is normally dated to the 170s, Marcus's last decade. That this was a dark and stressful period for him can hardly be doubted. In the 10 years between 169 and 179, he had to cope with constant fighting on the frontier, the abortive revolt of Cassius, and the deaths of his colleague Varus, his wife Faustina, and others. Though he could hardly have anticipated the century of turmoil that would follow his death, he may have suspected that his son and successor, Commodus, was not the man he hoped. That in these circumstances Marcus should have sought consolation in philosophy is only natural, but understanding what Marcus looked for from his philosophical studies requires a certain amount of orientation. To understand the Meditations in context, we must familiarize ourselves not only with Stoicism, the philosophical system that underlies the work, but also with the role of philosophy in ancient life more generally. Today, philosophy is an academic discipline, one that few people other than professional philosophers would consider central to their everyday existence. While we may think of ourselves as having a philosophy of life, it bears little relation to what goes on in the philosophy departments of our universities. The careers of 20th century analytic philosophy often seem remote from what the American philosopher Thomas Nagel terms mortal questions. The problems involved in making ethical choices, constructing a just society, responding to suffering, loss, and coming to terms with the prospect of death. Indeed, most of us would be inclined to see these issues as the province of religion rather than philosophy. For Marcus and his contemporaries, the situation was very different. Ancient philosophy certainly had its academic side. Athens and other large cities had publicly financed chairs of philosophy, and professional philosophers taught, argued, and wrote as they do today. But philosophy also had a more practical dimension. It was not merely a subject to write or argue about, but one that was expected to provide a design for living, a set of rules to live one's life by. This was a need not met by ancient religion, which privileged ritual over doctrine and provided little in the way of moral and ethical guidelines. Nor did anyone expect it to. That was what philosophy was for. Philosophy in the modern sense is largely the creation of one man, the 5th century BC Athenian thinker Socrates. We have several of his stuff played up here. But it is primarily in the Hellenistic period that we see the rise of philosophical sects, promulgating coherent belief systems that an individual could accept as a whole and which were designed to explain the world in its totality. Of these Hellenistic systems, the most important, both for Romans in general and for Marcus in particular, was the Stoic school. The movement takes its name from the stoa, porch, or portico, in downtown Athens, where its founder, Zeno, 332 to 262 BC, taught and lectured. Zeno's doctrines were reformulated and developed by his successors, Cleanthes, 331 to 232 BC, and Chrysippus, 280 C to 206 BC. Chrysippus, in particular, was a voluminous writer, and it was he who laid the foundations for systemic Stoicism. This early academic Stoicism is the source of certain key terms and concepts that reappear frequently in the Meditations, and proper understanding of Marcus's approach requires some familiarity with the system as a whole. Stoicism. Of the doctrines central to the Stoic worldview, perhaps the most important is the unwavering conviction that the world is organized in a rational and coherent way. More specifically, it is controlled and directed by an all-pervading force that the Stoics designated by the term logos. The term, from which English logic and the suffix logi derive, has a semantic range so broad as to be almost untranslatable. At a basic level, it designates rational, connected thought, whether envisioned as a characteristic, rationality, the ability to reason, or as the product of that characteristic, an intelligible utterance, or a connected discourse. Logos operates both in individuals and in the universe as a whole. In individuals, it is the faculty of reason. On a cosmic level, it is the rational principle that governs the organization of the universe. In this sense, it is synonymous with nature, providence, or God. When the author of John's Gospel tells us that the Word, Logos, was with God and is to be identified with God, he is borrowing Stoic terminology. All events are determined by the Logos and follow in an unbreakable chain of cause and effect. Stoicism is thus, from the outset, a deterministic system that appears to leave no room for human free will or moral responsibility. In reality, the Stoics were reluctant to accept such an arrangement and attempted to get around the difficulty by defining free will as a voluntary accommodation to what is, in any case, inevitable. According to this theory, man is like a dog tied to a moving wagon. If the dog refuses to run along with the wagon, he will be dragged by it. Yet the choice remains his to run or be dragged. In the same way, humans are responsible for their choices and actions, even though these have been anticipated by the Logos and form part of its plan. Even actions which appear to be, and indeed are, immoral or unjust advance the overall design, which, taken as a whole, is harmonious and good. They, too, are governed by the Logos. I have a similar but definitely different system of belief that I talk about in other playlists. But the Logos is not simply an impersonal power that governs and directs the world. It is also an actual substance that pervades the world, not in a metaphorical sense, but in a form as concrete as oxygen or carbon. In its physical embodiment, the Logos exists as pneuma, a substance imagined by the earliest Stoics as pure fire, and by Chrysippus as a mixture of fire and air. Pneuma is the power the vital breath that animates animals and humans, the Holy Spirit or becoming. It is in Dylan Thomas's phrase, the force that, through the green fuse, drives the flower, and is present even in lifeless materials like stone or metal as the energy that holds the objects together, the internal tension that makes a stone a stone. All objects are thus a compound of lifeless substance and vital force. When Marcus refers, as he does on a number of occasions, to cause and material, he means the two elements of these compounds, inert substance and animating pneuma, which are united as long as the object itself exists. When the object perishes, the pneuma that animated it is reabsorbed into the logos as a whole. This process of destruction and reintegration happens to individual objects at every moment. It also happens on a larger scale to the entire universe, which, at vast intervals, is entirely consumed by fire, a process known as ekpyrosis, and then regenerated. If the world is, indeed, orderly, if the Logos controls all things, then the order it produces should be discernible in all aspects of it. That supposition not only led to the Stoics to speculate about the nature of the physical world, but also motivated them to seek the rationality characteristics of Logos in other areas, notably in formal logic and the nature and structure of language. Their interest in etymology is reflected in several entries in the Meditations. This systematizing impulse reappears in many other fields as well. The catalogue of Chrysippus' own works, preserved by the late 3rd century biographer Diogenes Laertius, is very long indeed. It includes not only philosophical treatises on a narrow sense, but also works such as On How to Read Poetry and Against the Touching Up of Paintings. Later Stoics would try their hands at history and anthropology, as well as more conventionally philosophical topics. The expansion of Stoic thought was not only intellectual but also geographical. The movement had been born in Athens. In the century and a half that followed Chrysippus' death, it spread to other centers, in particular to Rome. The Romans of the 2nd century BC were in the midst of a course of conquest that by the end of the century would leave them the effective masters of the Mediterranean. With conquest came culture. Looking back on the rapid Hellenization of the Roman aristocracy between 200 BC and his own day, the poet Horace famously observed that conquered Greece was the true conqueror. Nowhere is the influence of Greece more obvious than in philosophy. Greek philosophers, including the Stoics Panaetius, circa 185 to 109 BC, and Posidonius, circa 135 to 50 BC, visited Rome to lecture. They spent extended periods there. In the 1st century BC, it became the fashion for young, upper-class Romans to study in Athens, in an ancient version of the 18th century Grand Tour. Roman aristocrats acted as patrons to individual philosophers and assembled large libraries of philosophical texts, like that at the famous villa of the Papyri at Herculaneum. The Romans, like Cicero and Lucretius, attempted to expound Greek philosophical doctrines in Latin. Of the major philosophical schools, it was Stoicism that had the greatest appeal. Unlike some other sects, the Stoics had always approved of participation in public life, and this stand struck a chord with the Roman aristocracy, whose code of values placed a premium on political and military activity. Stoicism has even been described, not altogether unfairly, as a real religion of upper-class Romans. In the process, it became a rather different version of philosophy from that taught by Zeno and Chrysippus. Perhaps the most important development was the shift in emphasis, a narrowing of focus. Early and middle Stoicism was a holistic system. It aimed to embrace all knowledge, and its focus was speculative and theoretical. Roman Stoicism, by contrast, was a practical discipline, not an abstract system of thought, but an attitude to life. Partly for historical reasons, it is this Romanized Stoicism that has the most influenced later generations. Indeed, the application of the adjective stoic to a person who shows strength and courage in misfortune probably owes more to the aristocratic Roman value system than it does to Greek philosophers. Stoicism in its later form was a system inspired as much by individuals as by texts or doctrines. One of the most distinguished adherents was Marcus Cato, known as Cato the Younger, to distinguish him from his great-grandfather, prominent a century earlier. A senator of renowned rectitude when Julius Caesar marched on Rome in 49 BC, Cato sided with Caesar's rival Pompey in the defense of the legitimate government. When it was clear that Caesar would triumph, Cato chose not to survive the Republic, killing himself after the Battle of Munda in 46. Within a century, he had become an emblem of Stoic resistance to tyranny. Under Nero, he was immortalized by the poet Lucan and praised in laudatory biography by the senator Thrasea whose own resistance to Nero cost him his life. Thracia's son-in-law, Helvidius Priscus, played a similar role and came to a similar end under Vespasian. Thrasea and Helvidius, in their turn, served as role models to the second-century aristocrats like Marcus's mentors, Rusticus, Maximus, and Severus. Marcus himself pays tribute to them and to Cato in Meditations 1.14. Cato, Thrasea, and Helvidius were doers, not writers, and their legendary heroism inevitably lends them somewhat two-dimensional quality. A more complex and much more interesting figure was the poet Lucan's uncle, Lucius Annius Seneca, circa 4 BC to AD 65, commonly known as Seneca the Younger to distinguish him from his equally distinguished father. Originally counselor to the young Nero, he was eventually forced to commit suicide after being implicated in an attempted coup against his erstwhile pupil. Men's lives are not always consistent with their ideals, and some critics have found it hard to reconcile Seneca's fabulous wealth and his shameless flattery of Nero with his philosophical views. Yet his works, in particular the letters to Lucilius, remain the most engaging and accessible expressions of later Stoicism. Because they were written in Latin, they were also among the most influential on succeeding generations. But not all Stoics were wealthy senators. There was another kind of Stoic exemplar as well, the outsider whose ascetic lifestyle won him the admiration of his wealthier contemporaries, and enabled him to criticize the pretenses of upper-class society with real authority. An early example of the type is Gaius Masonius Rufus, circa 30 to 100, a member of the Roman administrative class, the so-called Knights Equites, who were banished by both Nero and Vespasian. A still more dramatic example was Musonius's student Epictetus, circa 55 to circa 135, who had taken up the practice of philosophy as a slave and devoted the remainder of his life to it after being freed. He had been exiled to Nicopolis, in northern Greece, under Domitian. After the tyrant's death, elected to remain there, where he taught and lectured with visitors who often traveled great distances to study with him. One of these was the upper-class historian and statesman Arrian, circa 86 to 160, who published an extensive record of the master's discussions, a text conventionally referred to as the Discourses of Epictetus. He later produced an abridged version, the Enchiridion, the manual or handbook. Epictetus seems to have been an especially important figure for Marcus. He thanks his philosophical mentor Rusticus for introducing him to Epictetus's lectures, either the discourses themselves or a private set of lecture notes. And a series of quotations and paraphrases from the philosopher appear in Book 11 of the Meditations. And Arrian's abridged Enchiridion provides the closest literary parallel to the Meditations itself, not only in its content but also in its form, a series of relatively short and unrelated entries. Stoicism and the Meditations. The late Stoicism of Epictetus is a radically stripped down version of its Hellenistic predecessor, a philosophy which had learnt much from its competitors and had almost forgotten parts of itself. Both these tendencies, the narrowing of the field and the eclectic borrowing from non-Stoic sources, can be discerned also in the Meditations. Chrysippus and his followers had divided knowledge into three areas: logic, physics, and ethics, concerned respectively with the nature of knowledge, the structure of the physical world, and the proper role of human beings in that world. Marcus pays lip service to this triadic division in at least one entry, 8.13, but it is clear from the other chapters and from the Meditations as a whole that logic and physics were not his focus. Among the things for which he thanks the gods is that he was never absorbed by logic chopping or preoccupied by physics. 1.17. Occasional entries show an awareness of Stoic thought about language. The etymological pun in 8.57 is perhaps the clearest example, but they are the exception, not the rule. In many cases, Marcus's logic is weak, the logic of a rhetorician, not of the philosopher. It is rare to find a developed chain of reasoning like that in Meditations 4.4. His interest in the nature of the physical world is limited to its relevance to human problems. About one of the basic Stoic physical doctrines, the notion of the periodic conflagration, pyrosis, that ends a cosmic cycle, Marcus adopts an agnostic position, though he was not alone in this. I do not. I have a video specifically on that, the 12,000 year disaster cycle, and you are more than welcome to check that out because we are coming upon that time soon. Just to him, it was the ethics that was the basis of the system. Just because you've abandoned your hopes of becoming a great thinker or scientist, don't give up on attaining freedom, achieving humility, and serving others. The questions that the Meditations tries to answer are primarily metaphysical and ethical ones. Why are we here? How should we live our lives? Can we ensure that what we do is right? How can we protect ourselves against the stresses and pressures of daily life? How should we deal with pain and misfortune? How can we live with the knowledge that someday we will no longer exist? It would be both pointless and impertinent to try and summarize Marcus's responses. The influence of the Meditations on later readers springs in part from the clarity and insistence with which he addresses these questions. It may be worthwhile, however, to draw attention to one pattern of thought that is central to the philosophy of the Meditations, as well as to Epictetus, and that has been identified and documented in detail by Pierre Hadot. This is the doctrine of the three disciplines, the discipline of perception, of action, and of the will. The discipline of perception requires that we maintain absolute objectivity of thought, that we see things dispassionately for what they are. Proper understanding of this point requires a brief introduction to the Stoic theory of cognition. We have seen that for the Stoics, universal order is represented by the Logos. The Logos infuses and is wielded by our hegemonikon, literally, that which guides, which is the intellective part of our consciousness. In different contexts, it can approximate either will or character, and it performs many of the functions that English speakers attribute to the brain or the heart. One of its primary functions is to process and assess the data we receive from our senses. At every instant, the objects and events in the world around us bombard us with impressions. As they do so, they produce a fantasia, a mental impression. From this, the mind generates a perception, hypolepsis, which might best be compared to a print made from a photographic negative. Ideally, this print will be an accurate and faithful representation of the original, but it may not be. It may be blurred. It may include shadow images that distort or obscure the original. Chief among these are inappropriate value judgments, the designation as good or evil of things that are in fact neither good or evil. For example, my impression that my house is just burned down is simply that, an impression or report conveyed to me by my senses about an event in the outside world. By contrast, my perception that my house is burned down and I have thereby suffered a terrible tragedy includes not only an impression, but an interpretation imposed upon that initial impression by my powers of hypolepsis. It is by no means the only possible interpretation, and I am not obliged to accept it. I may be a good deal better off if I decline to do so. It is, in other words, not objects and events, but the interpretations we place on them that are the problem. Our duty is therefore to exercise stringent control over the faculty of perception, with the aim of protecting our mind from error. The second discipline, that of action, relates to our relationship with other people, human beings, for Marcus, as for the Stoics generally, are social animals. A point he makes often, e.g. 5.16, 8.59, 9.1. All human beings possess not only a share of the logos, but also the ability to use it. That is what makes us human and distinguishes us from the other animals. But it would perhaps be more accurate to say that we are participants in the logos, which is as much a process as a substance. Marcus himself more than once compares the world ruled by logos to a city in which all human beings are citizens, with all the duties inherent in citizenship. As human beings, we are part of nature, and our duty is to accommodate ourselves to its demands and requirements. To live as nature requires, as Marcus often puts it. To do this, we must make proper use of the logos we have been allotted, and perform as best we can the functions assigned to us in the master plan of the larger cosmic logos, of which it is a part. This requires not merely passive acquiescence in what happens, but active cooperation with the world, with fate, and, above all, with other human beings. We were made, Marcus tells us over and over, not for ourselves, but for others, and our nature is fundamentally unselfish. In our relationships with others, we must work for their collective good while treating them justly and fairly as individuals. Marcus never defines what he means by justice, and it is important to recognize what the term implies and what it does not. All human beings have a share of the logos, and all have roles to play in the vast design that is the world. But that is not to say that all humans are equal, or that the roles they are assigned are interchangeable. Marcus, like most of his contemporaries, took it for granted that human society was hierarchical, and this is borne out by the images he uses to describe it. Human society is a single organism, like an individual human body or a tree. But the trunk of the tree is not to be confused with the leaves, or the hands and feet with the head. Our duty is to act justly. Our duty to act justly does not mean that we must treat others as our equals. It means that we must treat them as they deserve, and their deserts are determined in part by their position in the hierarchy. Stoicism's emphasis on the orderliness of the universe implies a similar orderliness and harmony in its parts, and part of its appeal to upper-class Romans may have been that it did not force its adherents to ask difficult questions about the organization of the society they lived in. The third discipline, the discipline of will, is in a sense the counterpart to the second, the discipline of action. The latter governs our approach to the things in our control, those things that we do. The discipline of will governs our attitude to things that are not within our control, those that we have done to us by others or by nature. We control our own actions and are responsible for them. If we act wrongly, then we have done serious harm to ourselves, though not, it should be emphasized, to others or to the logos. By contrast, things outside our control have no ability to harm us. Acts of wrongdoing by a human agent, torture, theft, or other crimes, harm the agent, not the victim. Acts of nature, such as fire, illness, or death, can only harm us if we choose to see them as harmful. When we do so, we question the benevolence and providence of the logos, and thereby degrade our own logos. This, of course, we must not do. Instead, we must see things for what they are, Here, the discipline of perception is relevant, and accept them by exercising the discipline of will, or what Epictetus calls, in a phrase quoted by Marcus, the art of acquiescence. For if we recognize that all events have been foreseen by the Logos and form part of its plan, and that the plan in question is unfailingly good, as it must be, then it follows that we must accept whatever fate has in store for us, however unpleasant it may appear, trusting that, in Alexander Pope's phrase, whatever is right. This applies to all obstacles and apparent misfortunes, and in particular to death, a process that we cannot prevent, which therefore does not harm us, and which, accordingly, we must accept willingly as natural and proper. Together, the three disciplines constitute a comprehensive approach to life, and in various combinations and reformulations they underlie a large number of the entries in Meditations. We see them laid out starkly and explicitly in Meditation 7.54. Everywhere, at each moment, you have the option to accept this event with humility, will, to treat this person as he should be treated, action, to approach this thought with care, so that nothing irrational creeps in, perception. We find the same triad rephrased and reordered in Meditations 9.6, objective judgment, unselfish action, willing acceptance of all external events. And we find it in a more subtle form underlying Meditations 8.7. Progress for a rational mind means not accepting falsehoods or uncertainty in its perceptions, making unselfish actions its only aim, seeking and shunning only the things it has control over, embracing what nature demands of it, the nature in which it participates, as the leaf's nature does in the tree. A score of other entries could be cited. The almost obsessive repetition of these 3 points suggests that they lie at the very heart of Marcus's thoughts and of his project in the Meditations. Other influences. Marcus Aurelius is often thought of and referred to as the quintessential Stoic. Yet the only explicit reference to Stoicism in the Meditations, 5.10, is phrased in curiously distant terms, as if it were merely one school among others. The great figures of early Stoicism are conspicuous by their absence. Neither Zeno nor Cleanthes is mentioned in the Meditations, and Chrysippus appears only twice, quoted once in passing for a pithy comparison, 6.42, and included with Socrates and Epictetus in a list of dead thinkers, 7.19. This is not to deny the essentially Stoic basis of Marcus's thought, or the deep influence on him exercised by later Stoic thinkers, most obviously Epictetus. If he had to be identified with a particular school, that is surely the one he would have chosen. Yet, I suspect that if asked what it was that he studied, his answer would have not been Stoicism, but simply philosophy. There is nothing surprising about this. The imperial period saw the development of a widespread ecumenical tendency in philosophy. Adherents of the most major schools, the Platonists, Peripatetics, Cynics, and Stoics, preferred to focus on the points they shared rather than those that separated them. Not all the figures of Marcus credits as influential on his own philosophical development were Stoics. Severus, for example, was a Peripatetic, although authors like Seneca and Epictetus accepted the basic premises of the system developed by Zeno and Chrysippus. They showed no reluctance to borrow aphorisms, anecdotes, and argumentative strategies from non-Stoic sources. The Meditations follows a similar procedure. While built on a Stoic foundation, it also refers to and quotes a wide range of figures, both precursors of the Stoics and representatives of rival schools. Of the predecessors, Marcus invokes, the most important is surely Socrates, the great Athenian thinker who had helped redirect philosophy from a preoccupation with the physical world to a focus on the role of man in society and the nature of human morality. Socrates himself wrote nothing. His teachings were transmitted, and greatly elaborated, in the philosophical dialogues of the student Plato. You don't know that. You don't know that it was elaborated. It could have been exactly what he said. You do not know that. Marcus quotes Plato repeatedly, especially in Book 7, and Socratic or Platonic elements can be discerned elsewhere too. One example is the so-called Socratic paradox, the claim that no one does wrong willingly, and that if men were able to recognize what is right, they would inevitably do it. They are like this, Marcus says of other people, because they can't tell good from evil. 2.1. And he repeats this assertion everywhere. Socrates' character was as important as his doctrines. His legendary endurance and self-denial made him an ideal model for the Stoic philosopher, or any philosopher. His refusal to compromise his philosophical beliefs led him to make the ultimate sacrifice when he was put on trial at the age of 70 on trumped-up charges of impiety. We covered that in the Plato playlist. His displays of integrity at the trial and his comportment in the days leading up to his execution made it easy to view him as a forerunner of the first-century Stoic martyrs like Thrasea Paetus or Heldivius Priscus, and it is in this light that Marcus invokes him in Meditations 7.66. Of Socrates' predecessors, the so-called pre-Socratic thinkers, the most important, both for Marcus and the Stoics generally, was Heraclitus, the mysterious figure from Ephesus in modern-day Turkey, whose Zen-like aphorisms were proverbial for their profundity and obscurity alike. Heraclitus' philosophical system ascribed to a central role to logos and to fire as the primordial element. Both elements were naturally congenial to the Stoics and may well have influenced them. Heraclitus is mentioned in a handful of entries in Meditations, 4.46, 6.47, but his doctrines can be traced to many others. Moreover, his concision and epigrammic phrasing anticipate the kind of enigmatic apathogm we find in a number of entries. The best revenge is not to be like that, 6.6. Straight, not straightened, 7.12. The fencer's weapon is picked up and put down again. The boxer's is part of him, 12.9. None of that is enigmatic. Those are all self-explanatory. They're all self-explanatory. It is from Heraclitus that Marcus derives one of his most memorable motifs, that of the unstable flux of time and matter in which we move. We cannot step twice into the same river, Heraclitus has said, and we see Marcus expanding on the observation. Time is a river, a violent concurrent of events, glimpsed once and already carried past us, and another follows and is gone, 4.43, and compare 2.17, 6.15. Though Heraclitus was clearly the pre-Socratic who most influenced Marcus, other thinkers leave traces as well. Marcus twice borrows from the poet Empedocles' image of the self-contained soul as the perfect sphere, 8.41, 12.3, and he alludes once to the mystic doctrines of Pythagoreans, 11.27. Several entries explore the implications of phrases attributed to Democritus, one of the inventors of the theory of atoms, which would later inspire Hellenistic philosopher Epicurus. Neither Heraclitus or Socrates had founded a school. That was an achievement reserved for Plato, and then for Plato's student Aristotle, who broke from his master to found the Peripatetic movement. Marcus never refers to Aristotle, though he does quote approvingly from the latter's successor, Theophrastus, 2.10. Probably more important was another 4th century BC movement, Cynicism. The Cynics, of whom the first and most notorious was the irascible Diogenes of Sinope, were united less by doctrine than by a common attitude, namely their contempt for societal institutions and a desire for a life more in accord with nature. Check out my Exploring Philosophy if you would like to see Friedrich Nietzsche's thoughts on that. Diogenes himself was largely responsible for the image of a philosopher as an impoverished ascetic. The philosopher without clothes evoked by Marcus at Meditations 4.30 might well be a cynic. His famous claim to be a citizen of the world surely anticipates, if it did not actually influence, the Stoic conception of the world as a city-state. Marcus refers to Diogenes in several passages, as well as to the latter's student Monimus, 2.15, and invokes another cynic, Crates, and Meditations 6.13, in an anecdote whose tenor is now uncertain. Marcus's relationship to Epicureanism, Stoicism's great rival among Hellenistic philosophical systems, is much more vexed. The followers of Epicurus, 341 to 270 BC, believed in a universe radically unlike that posited by Zeno and Chrysippus. The Stoic world is ordered to the nth degree. The Epicurean universe is random, the product of haphazard conjunctions of billions of atoms. To speak of providence in such a world is transparently absurd, and while Epicurus acknowledged the existence of gods, he denied that they took any interest in human life. As for humans, our role is simply to live the best we can, making the most of what pleasures are available to us and insulating ourselves as far as possible from pain and anxiety. In particular, we are to feel no anxiety about death, which consists simply in the dissolution of our component atoms. This process is not only inevitable, but harmless, for the simple reason that after death there is no us to suffer harm. Although the sect numbered not a few prominent Romans among its adherents, it never attained the success of Stoicism, and was regarded with genial contempt by most outsiders. The quietism endorsed by the Epicureans was obviously different to reconcile with an active public life, an important Roman value, and the Epicurean equation of the good with pleasure was bound to raise eyebrows among conservative Romans. Eat, drink, and be merry was popularly supposed to be the Epicureans' motto, though Epicurus himself had been quite explicit in identifying pleasure with intellectual contemplation rather than the vulgar enjoyment of food and sex. Though a minority view, Epicureanism was, nevertheless, the only potential rival to Stoicism in offering a systemic cosmology, as Marcus acknowledges on a number of occasions by the stark dichotomy providence or atoms 4.3, 10.6, 11.18, 12.14. Marcus normally seems to view Epicureanism with disapproval, as we would expect. In Meditation 6.10, he contrasts the Epicurean universe, founded on mixture, interaction, dispersal, with the components of the Stoic system, unity, order, design, clearly to the advantage of the latter. Should we not be ashamed to fear death, he asks in another entry, when even the Epicureans disdain it? 12.34. But other entries suggest a less dismissive attitude. Marcus quotes with apparent approval Epicurus's account of his own exemplary conduct during an illness, 9.41, and twice seeks comfort in the philosopher's remarks on the endurance of pain, 7.33, 7.64. Like other late Stoics, Seneca is a notable example, he was willing to accept truth wherever he found it. Thus far, we have been concerned with the content of the Meditations, the ethical doctrine of late Stoicism, incorporating a certain amount of Platonic and Heraclitean material, and overlaid with occasional reference to other schools and thinkers. But what of the Meditations itself? How and why was it written? Who is its audience? What kind of book is it? For the answers to these questions, we must turn from the book's content to its form and origins. The Meditations, genre, structure, and style. I suspect that Marcus would have been surprised and perhaps rather dismayed to find himself enshrined in the modern library of the world's best books. He would have been surprised, to begin with, by the title of the work ascribed to him. The long-established English title, Meditations, is not only not original, but positively misleading, lending to a spurious air of resonance and authority quite alien to the haphazard set of notes that constitute the book. In the lost Greek manuscript used for the first printed edition, itself many generations removed from Marcus's original, the work was entitled to himself, Eis Huaton. This is no more likely than Meditations to be the original title, though it is at least somewhat more accurate description of the work. In fact, it seems unlikely that Marcus himself gave the work any title at all, for the simple reason that he did not think of it as an organic whole in the first place. Not only was it not written for publication, but Marcus clearly had no expectation that anyone but himself would ever read it. The entries include a number of cryptic references to persons or events that an ancient reader would have found as unintelligible as we do. While a contemporary might have recognized some of the figures mentioned in Meditations 8.25 or 12.27, for example, no ancient reader could have known what was in the letter that Rusticus wrote from Sinuessa 1.17, what Antonius said to the customs agent at Tusculum 1.16, or what happened to Marcus at Caeda 1.17. Elsewhere, Marcus reflects directly on his role as emperor, in terms that would be quite irrelevant to anyone else. We find him worrying about the dangers of becoming imperialized, 6.30, reminding himself to speak simply in the Senate, 8.30, and reflecting on the unique position he occupies, 11.7. From these entries and others, it seems clear that the you of the text is not a generic you, but the emperor himself. When you look at yourself, see any of the emperors, 10.31. How are we to categorize the Meditations? It is not a diary, at least in the conventional sense. The entries contain little or nothing related to Marcus's day-to-day life, few names, no dates, and with two exceptions, no places. It also lacks the sense of audience, the reader over one's shoulder, that tends to characterize even the most secretive diarist. Some scholars have seen it as the basis for an unwritten, larger treatise, like Pascal's Pensies or the notebooks of Joseph Joubert. Yet the notes are repetitive and, in a philosophical sense, too elementary for that. The entries, perhaps, bear a somewhat closer resemblance to the working notes of a practicing philosopher. Wittgenstein's Zettel, say, or the Cahiers of Simone Weil. Yet here too there is a significant difference. The Meditations is not tentative and exploratory, like the notes of Wittgenstein or Weil, and it contains little or nothing that is original. It suggests not a mind recording new perceptions or experimenting with new arguments, but one obsessively repeating and reframing ideas long familiar but imperfectly absorbed. Perhaps the best description of the entries is that suggested by the French scholar Pierre Hadot. They are spiritual exercises composed to provide a momentary stay against the stress and confusion of everyday life. A self-help book in the most literal sense. A revealing comment in this context is Meditations 5.9, where Marcus reminds himself not to think of philosophy as your instructor, but as the sponge and egg white that relieve ophthalmia, as a soothing ointment. On this reading, the individual entries were composed not as a record of Marcus's thoughts or to enlighten others, but for his own use, as a means of practicing and reinforcing his own philosophical convictions. Such an interpretation accounts for several aspects of the entries that would otherwise be puzzling. It explains the predominance of the imperative in the text. Its purpose is not to describe or reflect, let alone to meditate, but to urge, direct, and exhort. And it explains also the repetitiveness that strikes any reader of the work almost immediately, the continual circling back to the same few problems. The entries do not present new answers or novel solutions to these problems, but only familiar answers reframed. It was precisely this process of reframing and re-expressing that Marcus found helpful. The recognition that the entries are as much process as product also accounts for the shapelessness and apparent disorder of the work. We do not know by whom or by what basis the individual books of the Meditations were arranged. The order may be chronological or partly chronological, or wholly arbitrary. The arrangement of the individual entries may or may not be Marcus's own, though its very randomness suggests that it goes back to the author. A later editor would have been tempted to group together thematically similar entries, and perhaps to tie up some of the more obvious loose ends. Nor can we always be sure where individual entries begin and end. In some cases, this is a question Marcus himself may not have been able to answer. A special position is occupied by Book 1, which is distinguished from the rest of the work by its autobiographical nature and by the greater impression of conscious design and ordering apparent in it. It consists of 17 entries in which Marcus reflects on what he learned from various individuals in his life, either directly or from their example. Hence the title I have given the section here, Debts and Lessons, which has no warrant in the transmitted text. The entries roughly mirror the chronology of Marcus's early life, from his older relatives to his teachers to his adopted father, Antonius, and ultimately to the gods. This logical schema, as well as the increasing length of the entries, suggests deliberate arrangement, presumably by Marcus himself. If so, then this book, at least, was conceived as an organic whole. It may be among the latest portions of the text, if scholars are correct in thinking, as most do, that the short sketch of Antonius Pius in Meditations 6.30 was the starting point for the longer memoir in 1.16. Attempts to find organic unity in the remaining books or development from book to book were doomed to failure. Whenever one opens the Meditations, with the exception of Book 1, we find the same voice, the same themes. Marcus's thoughts do not change or develop noticeably from one book to another, nor can any structure or unity be discerned within individual books. It seems most likely that the division between books is a purely physical one. The transmitted books, in other words, represent the individual papyrus rolls of Marcus's original, or perhaps a later copy. When one had been filled, another was begun. If the books as a whole are homogeneous, the individual entries show considerable formal variety. Some are developed short essays that make single philosophical point. Many of the entries in books 2 and 3 are of this type. Others are straightforward imperatives. Take the shortest route. Or aphorisms. No one can keep you from living in harmony with yourself. Sometimes Marcus will list a number of basic principles in catalog format. Remember that, and that, and that. Elsewhere he puts forward an analogy, sometimes with the point of comparison left to be inferred. Thus, human lives are like many lumps of incense on the same altar, 4.15, or like a rock thrown in the air, 9.17. In other cases, the analogy will be made explicit. Have you ever seen a severed hand or foot? That's what we do to ourselves when we rebel against what happens to us, 8.34. Others present a kind of formal meditative exercise, as when Marcus instructs himself to imagine the age of Vespasian, 4.32, or Augustus's court, 8.31, and then compare the imagined scene with that of his own time. Portions of two books, 7 and 11, consist simply of quotations. Some entries appear to be rough drafts for others. Several of the raw quotations from tragedies in Book 7 are incorporated in the much more polished Meditations 11.6. The significance of some entries remains completely obscure. Few critics have known what to make of notes like character, dark, womanish, obstinate, 4.28, or they don't realize how much is included in stealing, sewing, buying, 3.15. The entries also differ considerably in the degree of artistry they display. Some entries are little more than Marcus's notes or reminders to himself, the philosophical equivalent of phone doctor, appointment Tuesday. But others are highly literary. Marcus wrote as a man trained in the rhetorical techniques of the 2nd century. His thoughts naturally took on the impress of his training and intellectual milieu, even when he was writing for himself alone. The shorter entries often display an interest in wordplay and a striving for epigrammatic brevity that recalls both the ingenuity of the rhetorical schools and the paradoxical compression of Heraclitus. Does the sun try to do the rain's work, or Asclepius, Demeter's, 6.43? Evil, the same old thing, 7.1. Not a dancer, but a wrestler, 7.61. To accept it without arrogance, to let it go with indifference. 8.33. The philosophical tradition may have been influential on another element that we find occasionally, the intermittent snatches of dialogue or quasi-dialogue. As a developed form, the philosophical dialogue goes back to Plato, who was later imitated by later philosophers, notably Aristotle in his lost works, and Cicero. The Meditations certainly does not contain the kind of elaborate scene setting that we expect in a true dialogue, but we do find in a number of entries a kind of internal debate in which the questions or objections of an imaginary interlocutor were answered by a second, calmer voice which corrects or rebukes its errors. The first voice seems to represent Marcus's weaker human side. The second is the voice of philosophy. The longer entries, none of course are very long, are marked by a coherent if sometimes slightly labored style. Not all critics have kind words for Marcus's expository prose, and some have been inclined to attribute perceived shortcomings to deficiencies in his Greek. But in all likelihood, the occasional awkwardness is due less to an imperfect grasp of the language than to a roughness of the composition, Marcus thinking aloud or groping for an idea. The same explanation may underlie one of the most noticeable features in Marcus's prose, namely, his tendency to string together pairs of near synonymous words and phrases, as if uncertain whether he has hit the target the first time. When combined with the very abstract vocabulary natural in philosophical prose, this can make for difficult reading, especially in English, which privileges concision and concrete vocabulary to a greater degree than Greek. At its best, however, Marcus's writing can be extraordinarily effective, most of all when it strikes a balance between image and idea, as in the opening of 5.23. Keep in mind how fast things pass by and are gone, those that are now and those to come. Existence flows past us like a river. The what is in constant flux, the why has 1,000 variations. Nothing is stable, not even what's right here. The infinity of past and future great gapes before us, the chasm whose depths we cannot see. This particular topic, the transience of human life, the constant change that shapes and informs the world, is a recurrent theme in Meditations, and as we shall see, it is one whose treatment owes as much to literary as well as philosophical models, and as much to Marcus's own character as to Stoic doctrine. Recurring themes. To try and extract a sustained and coherent argument from the Meditations as a whole would be an unprofitable exercise. It is simply not that kind of work. It would be equally fruitless to try and read autobiographical elements into individual entries. To take 9.42 as referring to the revolt of Avidius Cassius, for example, or 10.4 as a reflection on Commodus. All the more so since so few of the entries can be dated with any security. This is not to say that the Meditations has no unity or no relationship to Marcus's own life, for it has both. What unifies it is the recurrence of a small number of themes that surely reflect Marcus's own preoccupations. It is the points to which Marcus returns most often that offer the best insight into his character and concerns. One example that will strike almost any reader is the sense of mortality that pervades the work. Death is not to be feared, Marcus continually reminds himself. It is a natural process, part of the continual change that forms the world. At other points it is the ultimate consolation. Soon you will be dead, Marcus tells himself on a number of occasions, and none of it will matter. Cf. 4.6, 7.22, 8.2. The emphasis on the vanity and worthlessness of earthly concerns is here linked to the more general idea of transience. All things change or pass away, perish, and are forgotten. This is the burden of several of the thought exercises that Marcus sets himself. To think of the court of Augustus, 8.31, of the age of Vespasian or Trajan, 4.32, the great philosophers and thinkers of the past, 6.47, all now dust and ashes. The theme is not specific to Stoicism. We meet it at every turn in ancient literature. Marcus himself quotes the famous passage in Book 6 of Homer's Iliad, in which the lives of mortals are compared to leaves that grow in the spring, flourish for a season, and then fall and die, to be replaced by others. He would have recognized the sentiment in other writers too, from the melancholy Greek lyric poet Memnermus, who develops and expands on Homer's simile, to the Roman lawyer Servius Sulpicius, writing to his friend Cicero on the death of the latter's daughter. I want to share with you something that brought me not a little consolation in hopes that it might have the same effect on you. On my way back from Asia, on the voyage from Aegina to Megara, I gazed at the lands we passed. Aegina was behind me, Megara before me. Piraeus on the starboard side, Corinth to port. Towns which flourished once upon a time and now lie fallen in ruins before our eyes. And I said to myself, alas, and will you, Servius, not restrain your grief and recall that you were born a mortal? Believe me, the thought was no small consolation to me. This is not a point modern grief counselors would be inclined to dwell on, but it is one that Marcus would have understood perfectly, and its appeal to him cast light on both his character and his background. Marcus may have been a Stoic, but he was also a Roman, influenced not only by Zeno and Chrysippus, but by Homer and Virgil. Virgil is nowhere mentioned in the Meditations, and in the Greek work could hardly be quoted or alluded to. But there is a note of melancholy that runs through the work that one can only call Virgilian. Other concerns surface as well. A number of entries discuss methods of dealing with pain and bodily weakness of other sorts. When you have trouble getting out of bed, begin several entries, 5.1 and 8.12. A persistent motif is the need to restrain anger and irritation with other people, to put up with their incompetence or malice, to show them the error of their ways. Several entries focus on the frustrations of life at court, nowhere more present than when Marcus tells himself to stop complaining about them. 8.9. He contrasts the court against philosophy as a stepmother against a mother, only to be visited out of duty, but not someone we can really love. 6.12. Yet the court need not be an obstacle. It can be a challenge, even an opportunity, one that can lead a good life anywhere, even at court, as Antonius showed, 5.16, 1.16. No role is so well suited to philosophy, Marcus tells himself, as the one you happen to be in right now, 11.7. A more subtle clue to Marcus's personality is the imagery that he prefers. It is worth noting, for example, how many images of nature occur in the Meditations. Many readers have been struck by Meditations 3.2 with its evocation of nature's inadvertence in baking bread or ripening figs, olives and stalks of wheat. Metaphors and offhand comparisons in other entries evoke the pastoral and agricultural rhythms of the Mediterranean world, with its flocks, herds, and vines, its seasons of sowing and harvesting, its grapes drying slowly into raisins. Some of these may be stock examples, but even a stock example can be revealing. One can hardly read a page of Plato without tripping over the helmsmen, doctors, shoemakers, and other craftsmen who populated ancient Athens. Such figures are much rarer in Marcus. The image of society as a tree, whose branches are individual human beings, expresses an important Stoic principle. But the image is developed further than one might expect and informed by what might be personal observation. You can see the difference between the branch that's been there since the beginning, remaining on the tree and growing with it, and the one that's been cut off and grafted back. Affection for the natural world contrasts with a persistent sense of disgust and contempt for human life and other human beings, a sense that is difficult to derive from, or even reconcile with, Stoicism. As P. A. Brunt puts it, reason told Marcus that the world was good beyond improvement, and yet it constantly appeared to him evil beyond remedy. The courtiers who surrounded him are vain and obsequious, while the people he deals with on a daily basis are meddling, ungrateful, arrogant, dishonest, jealous, and surly. 2.1. One of the most frequently recurring points in Meditations is the reminder that human beings are social animals, as if this was a point Marcus had a particularly hard time accepting. The gods care for mortals, he reminds himself, and you, on the verge of death, you still refuse to care for them. There is a persistent strain of pessimism in the work. The things we want in life are empty, stale, and trivial. Dogs snarling at each other, quarreling children laughing and then bursting into tears a moment later. Trust, shame, justice, truth, gone from the earth and only found in heaven. Why are you still here? 5.33. Images of dirt appear in several entries. The world around us resembles the bath. Oil, sweat, dirt, grayish water, all of it disgusting. 8.24. If Marcus contemplates the stars, he does so only in order to wash off the mud of life below. 7.47. And the objective analysis Marcus prizes often shades over into a depressing cynicism, in the modern sense of the term. Disgust at what things are made of, liquid dust, bones, filth, or marble as hardened dirt, gold and silver as residues, clothes as hair, purple dye as shellfish blood, and all the rest. The human body itself is no more than rotting meat in a bag. 8.38. Despise your flesh, a mess of blood, pieces of bone, a woven tangle of nerves, veins, arteries. 2.2. Perhaps the most depressing entry in the entire work is the one in which Marcus urges himself to cultivate an indifference to music. 11.2. One scholar has observed, reading the Meditations for long periods can be conducive of melancholy, and even those who love the book cannot deny that there is something impoverishing about the view of human life it presents. Matthew Arnold, whose essay on the work reveals a deep respect and affection for Marcus, identified the central shortcomings of his philosophy as its failure to make any allowance for joy, and I think this is a fair criticism. Marcus does not offer us a means of achieving happiness, but only a means of resisting pain. The Stoicism of the Meditations is fundamentally a defensive philosophy. It is noteworthy how many military images recur, from references to the soul as being posted or stationed, to the famous image of the mind as an invulnerable fortress. 8.48. Such images are not unique to Marcus, but one can imagine they might have had special meaning for an emperor whose last years were spent in warfare and a journey far from home. 2.17. For Marcus, life was a battle, and often it must have seemed, what in some sense it must always be, a losing battle. There are also a handful of points in the text where we have glimpses of a different frame of mind, most obviously when Marcus refers to the gods. From a Stoic perspective, of course, God or the gods, the terms are used interchangeably by many ancient writers, are merely conventional terms for what we might equally well call nature or the logos or providence, or simply how things are. Marcus stresses the benevolence of this power. What is divine must be good, surely, but it is clear that he also ascribes to its actions the implacability with which orthodox Stoic doctrine endows it. It is not easy to see why one should pray to a power whose decisions one can hardly hope to influence, and indeed, Marcus several times seems to admit the possibility that one should not. All the more surprising, then, to find Marcus's elsewhere suggesting a more personal concern on the god's part. The final entry of Book 1 is the most obvious example. Here, Marcus indicates that the gods have aided him quite directly through their gifts, their help, their inspiration, just as they have others. Their help is curiously concrete. Among the things which they are thanked are remedies granted through dreams, including the one at Caeta. 1.17, the text is uncertain. The gods also assist other people, he reminds himself, just as they do you, by signs and dreams and every other way. 9.27. That Marcus himself did believe deeply in the gods, not merely as a figure of speech, but as a real force in his own life, is suggested by his refutation of those who doubt their existence. I know the gods exist, from having felt their power over and over. 12.28. How was this personal relationship with the divine to be reconciled with the impersonal logos of the Stoics? That's why he wasn't a Stoic. That's why he wasn't a Stoic. The question seems to be played out in the dialogue at Meditations 9.40. But those are things the gods left up to me, protests one voice, to which another responds. And what makes you think the gods don't care about what's up to us? Marcus himself may not have fully recognized or acknowledged this conflict, but its existence may point to a half-conscious awareness that the answer Stoicism offered was not, in every respect, satisfactory. How again later influences than his death? How or by whom the Meditations was preserved is unknown. The late 14th century Historia Augustus paints a picture of Marcus lecturing on the Meditations to a spellbound audience at Rome, one of the charming fantasies in which this peculiar work abounds, but certainly an invention. The passage does suggest, however, that the text was in circulation by the 4th century, when it is also mentioned by the orator Themistus. It was very likely familiar also to a contemporary of Themistes's, the neo-pagan emperor Julian, known in the later ages as Julian the Apostate, in whose dialogue, the Caesars, Marcus is pictured as a model for the kind of philosopher-king that Julian himself aspired to be. The century that followed Themistius and Julian was one of decline, at least in the West, decline in the political institutions, and also in the knowledge of Greek. For the next 1,000 years, Marcus's work, like that of Homer and Euripides, would remain unknown to Western readers. Copies survived in the Greek-speaking East, of course, but even there the Meditations seem to have been little read. For centuries all traces of it is lost, until at the beginning of the 10th century it reappears in a letter from the scholar and churchman Aristus, who writes to a friend, "I've had for a while now a copy of Emperor Marcus's invaluable book. It was not only old, but practically coming apart. I have had it copied, and it can now pass on to posterity in better shape. Whether Aristus's copy was indeed responsible for the work's survival, we do not know. At any rate, its readership seems to have increased in the centuries that followed. It is quoted a generation or two later by the vast Byzantine encyclopedia known as the Suda, and it was perhaps around this period that an unknown Byzantine poet composed a brief appreciation that came to be copied along with the text. On the Book of Marcus. If you desire to master pain, unroll this book and read with care, and find in it abundantly a knowledge of the things that are, those that have been, and those to come. And know as well that joy and grief are nothing more than empty smoke." The fall of Constantinople and the Turks in 1453 led to an exodus of scholars, bringing with them the Greek text that inspired the Italian Renaissance. The Meditations must have been among them. Yet even at this date the work's survival hung by a thread. The only complete manuscript to survive is a 14th century codex, now in the Vatican, of course, which is riddled with errors. The first printed edition did not appear until 1559, when Wilhelm Holtzmann, known as Xylander, produced a text from what seems to have been a more reliable manuscript. That manuscript, unfortunately, has not survived, but even at its best it was a very imperfect witness to what Marcus himself wrote. Our text of the Meditations contains a number of passages that are garbled, or in one or more crucial words seem to have been omitted. Some of these errors may be due to the confused state of Marcus's original copy. Others may have been accidentally introduced in the course of the copying and recopying that the work underwent in the millennium following Marcus's death. In some cases, the informed guesswork of scholars over several centuries has been able to restore the original text. In others, there is still uncertainty. The Meditations have never attracted great interest from professional students of the classics, and the reasons are perhaps understandable. It contains few direct references to historical events and provides relatively little material for social historians. As evidence for later Stoicism, it pales besides the greater bulk of Epictetus's discourses. Yet it has always exerted a fascination on those outside the narrow orbit of classical study. Perhaps especially on those who can best appreciate the pressures that Marcus himself faced. The Meditations was among the favored reading of Frederick the Great. A recent American president has claimed to reread it every few years. But it has attracted others too, from poets like Pope and Goethe and Arnold to the Southern planter William Alexander Percy, who observed in his autobiography that there is left to each of us, no matter how far defeat pierces, the unassailable wintry kingdom of Marcus Aurelius. It is not outside, but within, and when all is lost, it stands fast. If Marcus has been studied less than many ancient authors, he has been translated more than most, but it has been a generation since his last English incarnation, and the time seems ripe for another attempt. My attention in what follows has been to represent in readable English both the content and the texture of Meditations. I have been especially concerned to convey the patchwork character of the original, both the epigrammatic concision that characterizes some entries and the straggling discurvousness of others. I hope the result will bear out my conviction that what a Roman emperor wrote long ago for his own use can still be meaningful to those far removed from him in time and space. We do not live in Marcus's world, but it is not as remote from us as we sometimes imagine. There could be no better witness to the effect of Meditations on a modern reader than the Russian poet Joseph Brodsky, whose essay, Homage to Marcus Aurelius, takes his departure from the famous statue of the emperor on the Capitoline Hill in Rome. I saw him for the last time a few years ago on a wet winter night in the company of a stray Dalmatian. I was returning by taxi to my hotel after one of the most disastrous evenings in my entire life. The next morning I was leaving Rome for the States. I was drunk. The traffic moved with the speed one wishes for one's funeral. At the foot of the Capitol, I asked the driver to stop, paid, and got out of the car. Presently I discovered I was not alone. A middle-sized Dalmatian appeared out of nowhere and quietly sat down a couple feet away. Its sudden presence was so oddly comforting that momentarily I felt like offering it one of my cigarettes. For a while we both stared at the horseman statue, and suddenly, presumably because of the rain and rhythmic pattern of Michelangelo's pilasters and arches, all got blurred, and against that blur, the shining statue, devoid of any geometry, seemed to be moving. Not at any great speed, and not out of this place, but enough for the Dalmatian to leave my side and follow the bronze progress. We are going to skip further reading. That is a lot more to read. I'm going to see if there's something on the other side of it. We're going to skip acknowledgments and the introduction notes. And so this is where we're going to wrap it up. This was exceedingly long. I was really not expecting to be pushing close to 2 hours, but I did figure it would go longer than normal. I'm beyond blessed that I was able to speak for this long in one stretch. It is amazing. I didn't even have to take a break. I did not have a whole lot to add to this. I do expect to have a lot to add to further discussions as we read through the actual writings of Marcus. There was a lot in this that I didn't necessarily agree with, but it was just talking about historical context, and so we will deal with it when it comes up later. Hopefully I brought a little bit of enlightenment, not too much confusion, to a series of somewhat difficult topics. And if you really like what I'm doing here, let me know down below. Give me a like, share, and a sub. Throw me a comment. Let me know you appreciate it. Or if you don't, if you agree or disagree, if it remains respectful, it gets to remain up. And if you really like what I'm doing, hit me with the super thanks, because I am not a communist. To the crew, thanks for hanging out. I appreciate every single minute that you are here with me, and I am praying for you every single day. Until next time, I love you. God loves you. You are perfect, whole, and complete just the way that you are. And this has been Pitt State. Peace.